Going on to World History, Chapter 7.2, The Politics of Ancient Greece. And we're going to be talking about the changing governments of the city-states in Greece, the Spartan military state, and the Athenian democracy. Two total different Greek states and two total different ideas about politics. So here we have a picture of the democracy. This is Athens, Greece. The changing governments. First were the Greek family. Started with one man responsible who held absolute authority and kind of went by their ancestral gods. And then each state ruled by one. And that ruled by one meant that it was a monarchy. The word monarchy, mono means one, so monarchy means one ruler. It could be a king, yes, it could be a king, one ruler, or it could just be a one ruler over each city-state. The monarch advised the Council of Elders. It was advised by the Council of Elders, I should say, and the Assembly. So they would they would have a mass meeting of all the citizens, and then they would counsel the king or the queen or the monarch. So, and that's what kind of happens in most monarchies, that they have a council of elders to counsel them on different policies, right? So the Greeks, though, were the first to reject this one-man rule of monarchy. They decided they didn't like that. Well, it went from that monarch, though, to for the aristocracy. So aristocracy rules by the best. So they're the aristocrats that rule. So, and they had the noble birth, and they were thought better than others, and they thought themselves better than others. And they obtained their rule by inheritance. The wealthiest men in the city were the most powerful. And then warriors had to buy their own horses, so only aristocrats could afford those horses, so most of the warriors were aristocrats, the wealthy. The new aristocrats were rich through foreign trade, though. So now, not just being born in a wealthy family, but now we have a lot of merchants becoming aristocrats. And they didn't have the noble birth, but they had the money. And so it was the decline of the old family and the rise of Olympics. So basically, even that, the Olympics brought in those warriors. And the aristocrats, the new aristocrats, became very prestigious and powerful. And they now demanded a voice in the government, not just having the old aristocrats rule them. It's a picture here. Oligarchy. So oligarchy is a rule by the few, and tyranny is ruled by a tyrant. So what's the difference? So we have some pictures. We have a few and we have one tyrant. So it went from monarchy to aristocracy to oligarchy to tyranny to democracy, and then back to tyranny and on to oligarchy. So the cycles would go through Greek cycles of rule and politics and going on to the next stage. And sometimes the stage would stop at a certain point. But the people grew tired of a few rich men in charge. And so the ambitious, influential men seized power for themselves. So those men would have an insurrection or a rebellion, and then a tyranny. A tyranny would win support of the people by promises, but when in power, their true selfish nature would come, and a tyrant would appear. A tyrant would be someone that takes power by force. And so you have a tyrant that's taking power by force. So here we have these cycles. So let's look, the next tells the cycles. So oligarchy. This is Sparta, the power in the hands of a few wealthy citizens. Okay? And this is the power in the hands of a hereditary figure that inherits the throne, a king. And tyranny, heredity, no. Sole ruler who took power by force versus inheritance. They didn't inherit it, they just forced and took power. And this says, we Athenians are called a democracy, for the administration is in the hands of the many and not the few, with equal justice to all alike in their private disputes. And so in the midst, we have all these. As for the democracy, though, it was very short-lived. So the best type of democracy that we have is by representation. But they didn't have that democracy at first. Pericles here, we'll talk more about him. He was into the democracy. So democracy is ruled by many, or by the common people. When poor became discontent of a tyrant, they decided they wanted the citizens to rule instead in the city-states. Well, does that mean that everybody rules? Not really. You see, women were not citizens, and the slaves could be up to a fourth or more of the quarter of the population. A fourth of the population were slaves. Slaves were not citizens. And men that were born outside of the state, like merchants, could not participate either. So really, the polis, or when you say polis, you think of politics. That's the word for politics. The polis that could vote would only be a few hundred men. So the polis was really the city government. So anyway, it caught in this vicious cycle, like I said before. Here's a picture. You have a monarchy with a king, and then you go on, from the monarchy to the aristocrats, and then from the aristocrats, you go to democracy or tyrant, in this cycle here. So oligarchy is ruled by a few, to tyranny and to democracy again. So I'm caught into this vicious cycles, and truly Athens did, truly the Greeks did. Except for Sparta, because the Spartan millet was a military state, and it stayed a military state. It was an oligarchy. It was ruled by a few, and it was strictly regimented by the military state. There were 3 classes. There was the ruling class, the middle class, and the helots, or the slaves. 3 classes, and they stayed as 3 classes in the state of Sparta. And the ruling class made up the oligarchy. An oligarchy, as I said, would be the few, and there would just be a few true Spartans that would make up this oligarchy. And then the middle class would be the merchants and the businessmen. And some middle class had rights and privileges, of course, but the helots, they farmed the estates of the ruling class, and they had no rights or privileges. They were conquered peoples and considered slaves. But Sparta expanded by conquering more people. So it controlled most of the Peloponnesus area. So that whole area was controlled by a few. The helots outnumbered the Spartans as much as 15-1. So saying their slaves, their helots, would want to be possibly gain control. So they had to have strict martial law that was needed to control the populace. So these few Spartans, they're 15-1, they had to make sure that their helots, those lower class people, were kept in order. So they had a secret police to keep a tight rein on their slave labor. So this here shows like a war type situation, but it wasn't a war. But they did use their soldiers to keep a rein on their slave labor. Spartan training. Okay, the Spartans spent time, they needed to be able to fight, so they had to train while the helots worked in the fields. So they would be able to control them, and they would also be able to fight in their wars. The physical training for a Spartan was a military age of 7. So when you were 7 years old, can you believe that? 7 years old, you would have to join the military training, which would be rigorous, and you'd have to learn how to survive even by stealing food. And usually when a Spartan was caught for stealing, they were whipped, of course, and they were chastised, but they basically were whipped because they were caught, not because of what they did, because they were taught to do that. The Spartan girls too were subject to athletics, but their athletics would be so that they become strong, so they can train to bear children and to rear strong citizens. So bear and rear strong citizen was the gift of the Spartan women. At age 30, a young man would be admitted to the assembly after years of training. Otherwise, he basically was just used as the military. Spartan absolute control. So the chief duty of a young man was to be a soldier. And if someone could not fulfill this duty, they had no value. That means that disabled people, disabled babies, would be abandoned. They did not want weak children. So they did not respect the sanctity of life as we do. Well, not all of us. Today, the sanctity of life is really not observed very much with things like abortion. But back then, they did not know God. And every person we know has an eternal soul and priceless worth to God, but only God has the right to decide when the life is to end. So the Spartans, they decided if a child was not worthy, or if a person was not worthy, that they could be put to death. A slave could be put to death if a slave was disabled. It was not a great place to live, I would say. The Spartan had extensive government, which meant that the government ruled every part of a person's life. And this results in what? Intellectual stagnation, because the people were not allowed to do anything that the government would not allow. So the Peloponnesian League was Sparta's chief accomplishment, but Sparta did not really achieve much after Sparta was gone. So the Peloponnesian League, is the alliance with Corinth, Megara, and other cities in the Peloponnesus. Peloponnesus is that peninsula, So the causes of the Peloponnesian War would happen because many Greeks outside of Athens resented Athenian domination suddenly. And Sparta formed the Peloponnesian League to rival the Delian League. So we're going to talk about this. So we're going to have a split between the way Sparta thinks about things and the way Athens thinks about things. They're both Greeks, but they think totally different. And now Athens, gaining control, is going to be a rival, of course, of Sparta. So we're going to see a type of civil war forming. And which lifestyle would influence the other city-states? Which type of government would be the ruling type of government? The Athenian politics. Now we're talking not about Sparta, but we're talking about Athens. And so Athens, basically towards the mainland, when you talk the Attica, and then you see Sparta on the Peloponnesian Peninsula, but the whole area is now going to be in turmoil because we have two different lifestyles, two different political views, kind of like today. But anyway, the monarchy in Athens, with the kings, as Athens started with kings, and that after the death, this is a little bit of history about Athenian politics. So the monarchy started with the kings, and then from the kings, the death of Codrus in 1050 BC was the last king. And so The archon, or the chief chosen of the royal family, the ruler then, would first rule for a life, and then 10 years, and then 1 year. So here we would have this ruler that would appear, and then 9 archons elected from the noble class. And so when they got the 9 archons, that's the leader, they had 9 leaders, they became aristocracy. And aristocracy was different because it was just run by aristocrats, so as we said before. Here's the picture, kind of a picture of Athens, a ruin of Athens at their political temple. Draco's code. So who is Draco? Well, Draco came then as a ruler, and he had a demand. People demanded actually for written laws, and Draco demanded written laws. So Draco in 620 BC directed to prepare law codes. So his law codes, though, and though we had laws, were very merciless, and like written in blood, they would say. Why did they say that? Because they were so harsh that almost every offense punishment was the death penalty. So Draco's ruled that they had authority to codify, publish the laws, all the laws, and the harsh laws would be written in blood, and people would get angry with the nobles then, because for little tiny crimes they would get the death penalty, as well as harsher crimes. So they thought Draco was abusing his power. They were so severe that people today refer to harsh laws as draconian law. So when you hear the word draconian law, it means harsh rules or harsh law. Even today we use that. So think of Draco's code as a harsh code. Solon's laws. Well, who is Solon? Well, he was an Athenian statesman, and also he was a poet, and he had a soft heart. So anyway, conditions grew worse because of Draco's codes. And so Athens had a threat of anarchy. Things were getting confusing. So in 594 BC, Solon was elected archon. Archon is that leader, right? So Solon repealed the harsh codes of Draco, and he relieved the debtors. He redeemed many slaves, setting them free, and forbid the sale or payment with children. A lot of people couldn't pay their bills, so they'd give their children as slaves. Can you imagine that? And then he ordered the fathers now had to teach their sons a trade, so that the sons would have something to do when they grew up and knew how to do. So he told them they needed to teach them a trade, and required his sons to take care of their fathers. If their father did educate them, that they'd have to take care of their fathers and not let them be destitute when they got old. So those were some amazing new things, way on the opposite end of Draco's code. The Council of 400. So Solon gave every freeborn native a vote in the assembly now. So they all had, if they were freeborn, they would have a vote. And he created a council of 400. Council of 400. Now we're getting more into democracy, aren't we? And so the new growth happened in 600 BC, and now there was new wealth in Athens. But we needed structure based on property rather than birth now. Before, it was just an inherited few that usually ran the city-states. But now, based on property, so if you owned property, you could definitely be a citizen. Solon divided the classes into 4 by their income, of course, so the wealthier people were in the top class. All 4 were considered citizens, but only the top 3 could hold office. Of those upper class, the upper classes had to pay taxes and equip the soldiers, but they ended up on only the bottom class could not vote. The court of Areopagus. The court of Areopagus, what is that? Or Areopagus, I think you pronounce it. It was only the wealthiest could serve as archons in the court of Areopagus. And it met on that hill by that name, at Areopagus, on that hill. Here it is, actually a picture of it. So they repealed the laws that were hurtful to the state and looked after the public's morals and rebuked a person not bringing up his children right. So if you didn't bring up your children right, then you were under the law. So, which way could be strict. So here we have, when you think of Areopagus, think of this top mountain setting there, and that's an ancient ruin. But only the wealthiest could serve as archons in the court of Areopagus. The first tyrants. Okay, let's stop there because I'm getting long on this one, and we'll go on in our next video.